katoa, ko Ingarani me Piripini te whakapaparanga mai, ko Leicester me Bristol te whenua tupu, ko Tamaki Makaurau te kāinga, Industry Research Liaison Manager OE New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, ko Kyla Archer toku ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. Again, apologies for the false start on this one. That was a user error on my part, but we're so glad that you're able to join us at 1 p.m. instead of 12:30. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Scott Champion and Mark Elliott from Primary Purpose. Some of you may recognise Scott from a previous role as CEO of Beef and Lamb New Zealand, but also more recently on his appointment to the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre board. Scott has worked across tertiary education, innovative organisations in the private sector, and industry service delivery and advocacy for more than 20 years. His colleague Mark is an experienced social researcher focused on listening to and understanding a diverse range of primary sector participants. These include farmers and growers, service providers, and agribusiness leaders. And he's led many complex qualitative and quantitative research studies and ensuring strong methodology is applied to how Primary Purpose gathers and analyzes data. His focus is on practice change, communications, and stakeholder research. And as Scott said, is the brains behind this survey. They both work for Primary Purpose, which is a design-led strategy, research, evaluation, and advisory firm specializing in food, agriculture, and natural resources. And today they'll be presenting on a survey that they conducted on New Zealanders' attitudes towards food-producing industries. So I'll let Scott and Mark do more of the talking. If you do have any questions, I will be hosting a Q&A with them at the end of the presentation. So please put any of your questions into the Q&A function. Okay, guys, over to you.
Great, thanks, Kyla, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Scott, and along with my colleague Mark Elliott, we're two-thirds of the business of Primary Purpose. So we're a little consulting practice of three partners, and we do almost all of our work in the food and fibre industry. So today we're going to be talking about a piece of work that we did at the very end of last year around public perceptions of New Zealand's food producing industries. And we'll give you a little bit of background as to what sort of prompted us to do this work and what we think some of the implications might be, as well as stepping through some of the outputs. Probably just note that if you've got any questions about methodology, we're happy to cover those in the Q&A. And Mark led this piece of work in terms of the methodology and the execution. So I'll be able to answer any of those as well. And both Mark and I can comment on what we think some of the outcomes mean. So in terms of the process today, we'll just give you a little bit of background of Primary Purpose. Kyla's already covered much of that, and a bit of background to the work. So sort of why is it that we decided we'd have a look at this? And so every 6 months or so, we try to look at something topical, and this is the most recent piece. Very quickly, we'll just talk about the methodology and then step through the key results, both the quantitative, but also some of the qualitative commentary that comes through as well. And I think there's some useful insights in that in terms of what some of the data means. And then we'll talk about a bit of a summary and the implications, and then open it up into that broader question and answer piece as we get towards the end. So just very quickly about Mark and I and our other partner colleague, Kelvin Wall. So our practice was founded in 2017, and as Kyla said, we describe ourselves as a strategy advisory and social research firm specialising in food, agriculture and horticulture and natural resources. So we don't do on-farm consulting in agriculture, so we all have technical or farming backgrounds, but we're not working directly in terms of providing management advice to farmers and to growers. So we're often working with organisations. They could be commercial agribusiness, they might be the industry bodies across all of our sectors, or they could be other sort of not-for-profits. So we do a little bit of work with government, but often that's in the context of broader sector work. The other thing about us, and Kyla also mentioned this, is that we talk about having a human-centred focus. So we're really interested in people and what they do. And because a lot of the work in strategy focuses on change or on locking in things that are really important to organisations and to individuals, the role of people in that is fundamental. So inherently that sits in the work that we do, and that's a really key part here of thinking about what are these public perceptions of agriculture and what might that mean inside the sector. And so, as I've said, there are three partners in the firm, and all of us have agriculture backgrounds in different parts of the sector. Just in terms of the background to the work, or the why, if you like, all of us have seen over recent years a lot of sector discussion on the perceptions of agriculture, but often they're amongst ourselves, they're inside the sector. And often our sense was that they weren't necessarily based on some really good data. And so what we wanted to do was try and, in a simple way, put some data against some of those conversations. There's a phrase that often gets used both particularly inside the sector but also elsewhere about a rural-urban divide, or a perception that this rural-urban divide exists. And so again, we were interested in sort of seeing what the data said about public perception, and did it differ across different sectors, did it differ across different age groups, and we'll try and draw out some of that messaging as we go through, because we've seen this, as I say, come up in a number of our conversations. In fact, I was doing in another project, I was talking to a farmer this morning who referenced this. And so it's sort of become part of the discussion, or an assumption, if you like, that this rural-urban divide exists. And we wanted to really understand whether that was the case. We also think that what we believe and the views that we hold, like a rural-urban divide, for example, are really important in terms of messaging and behaviours. So they change the way we behave and the way we interact, but they also change the way we perceive or are perceived by others. And so again, having some data and trying to contribute to that conversation in a constructive way was one of the things that we wanted to do here, rather than just make assumptions going forward. Also, we wanted to build and expand on previous data, and so we'll reference some comparisons when we get through into the results that talk about a piece of work that Mark led in 2021. But there've also been some other versions of this work, probably going back over 8 or 10 years now. So people have been thinking about this and trying to understand the broader public perceptions within New Zealand of food and agriculture and horticulture. And we wanted to sort of add to that in a contemporary way, because a lot of things have changed over the past few years, whether that was COVID, whether that was sort of changing market mix, whether that was the rise of other conversations like domestic food security, and we've seen all of those things coming to the fore. Just in terms of the methodology, and again, Mark can cover off on some of this in more detail, both in terms of sort of the way we executed this piece of work and some of the limitations in terms of the methodology and interpretation. So these results are drawn from questions that were in a nationwide online omnibus survey. So that surveyed 1,050 New Zealanders 18 years of age and over. So in terms of how we did this work, that was the sample space. In terms of margin of error, so for a 50% figure at the 95% confidence interval level, the margin of error for this survey is plus or minus 3.1%. So the usual things that you'll often see described in terms of a survey like this. And this piece of work was in the field from 19 to 29 November 2024. So it's coming up to sort of 5 or 6 months old now. And is the most recent piece of work that we've done in this space. So I'll just get into some of the results now and try and sort of highlight these, and I'll just sort of explain the way that they're presented as we step through these. So I'm going to present three areas where we've got some quantitative data, and I'll step through the graphics, etc., when we get into each of those. But as I said earlier on, we also want to step through some qualitative sort of feedback we got, particularly around why were people positive or why were they negative towards the sectors. And I think there's some interesting messaging and some things that we can think about in that as well. So the first one is this sort of broad public opinion of food producing industries. And the question was, do you have a more positive or negative view of each of the following? And so these bars running horizontally across this look at different sectors, if you like. So, for example, we think about vegetable growing, fruit growing, kiwi fruit, and we tried to describe these so that we get clarity between different sectors. So, for example, historically or previously, I should say, often horticulture has been bunched together. So, here in this particular piece of work this year, we split out the horticultural industries and also the viticulture and winemaking industry as well. And we have data from previous years for sheep and beef farming, for dairy farming, and for deer farming, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in terms of comparison from previous data sets to this one. So the way these work, as you can see, is the darker green on the left-hand side is people who were responding that they were strongly positive around these sectors in terms of their views. And then as it moves from left to right through the lighter greens into the greys and the blues, it moves into strongly negative. So the dark grey right in the middle, often quite a small slice in these, is an unsure. And so the message here is that generally, particularly if we look at the strongly positives and the positives, the ones and the twos, when we add those together, they're the numbers in the circles, we see positivity ranging from 52% for deer farming through to 81% for vegetable growing. So typically quite strong levels of support. For some of our sectors, deer farming would be a notable one down the bottom. A smaller sector that isn't necessarily as well known. Some quite high levels of people saying they were unsure. So probably they're just not necessarily familiar with the sector at all. And then that going through to much smaller levels of unsure in vegetables, for example. We called out just a couple of key messages, I guess, on the right-hand side of the slide here. So I'll talk to this in a moment, but older New Zealanders were likely to be more positive across all of the industries than younger New Zealanders, and younger New Zealanders conversely likely to be less positive. And so we'll, as I say, we'll talk about that in a minute. So in terms of looking at some different data sets, I mentioned that comparative work's been done in 2019, 2020, 2021, and now in 2024. And so this looks at the animal industries where we did have those previous years' data to make a comparison on how are those perceptions trending. Now, obviously, they bounce around a little bit, but to some extent, we're seeing slight increases across all of the industries. So the question that was asked here again is, do you have a more positive or a negative view of the following industries? And the data presented here across the multiple years is a summation of both the strongly positive and the positive, so the ones and the twos. I'll just note on the right-hand side that for deer farming, we only have data for 2021 and 2024. So for those earlier years, deer farming wasn't split out and no data is available for it. And also in those previous years, we don't have data for the horticulture industries as well. So only for our livestock industries, both dry stock, sheep and beef and deer, and also for the dairy industries as well. If we look, sorry, I think I've skipped one here. Yeah, I have. Positive ratings by age was the other point here. And so here we're looking at just the data from 2024, and we've split it into those different age ranges. So on the left-hand side for each of the industries, for each of the four clustered bars for the industry is 18 to 29-year-olds, going through 30 to 44-year-olds, 45 to 59-year-olds, and then 60 plus. And this is the data just sort of really highlighting the point I made earlier that across all of the industries, we see older people more positive about the sectors. Their perception is more positive than younger people. And we wanted to just have a bit of a think about that later on in terms of what that might mean. So it's really striking that there are quite noticeable, almost linear improvements with age across all of the sectors that were surveyed or were asked about in terms of this survey. Just want to talk too about some qualitative data that came back and people were given the opportunity here to express some comments or to connect to particular reasons why they felt positive about the sectors. So here the question was, thinking about your reasons for holding a positive view of food growing industries generally, what, if any, is the main reason that comes to mind for you? I recognise that some of the text in the middle of the slide might be a little bit difficult to read, but what happened is these were categorised into different categories. So economic impact, food security, looking down the left-hand side, health and nutrition, environmental sustainability, social benefits, national identity and self-sufficiency, and practical advantages. And so those have been ordered in order of response. So the more people were saying that they were positive because of one of these, the higher up the list it is. So the biggest area of positivity was around a set of reasons relating to economic impact, with 42% of those surveyed connecting to something around a factor relating to economic impact. And that goes down as we go down the list. So food security was 24%, for example. Practical advantages at the very bottom was 8%. But you can see some sort of significant numbers, I guess, around areas like self-sufficiency, so not having to rely on imports, contribution to economic growth, cost reductions, so lowering the cost of living through domestic production having been cheaper, or the perception that domestic food production would be cheaper, under economic impact, and also feeding the population, in fact, was the highest level of support in ensuring a stable and abundant food supply for New Zealanders. And certainly in our work, probably over the last 5 years or so, we've seen that domestic food security argument becoming more readily discussed. So that sort of aligns with what we've seen in our work as well. If we go to the reasons that people responded negatively, then the key categories here were around environmental concerns, economic issues, ethical and social concerns, health and food safety, farming practices, sustainability challenges, and social and cultural criticisms. And again, the biggest ones, if you like, related to environment at the top of the list there, particularly chemical use and environmental impact. And a couple of other key ones were around within the economic issue category, high cost. So almost the inverse of the perception expressed on the positivity side, that is that people felt locally grown food was often more expensive than imported food. And then going down to health and food safety, contamination, the first one there in that category, concerns about chemicals, genetic modification, unsafe food additives was another one of the things that stood out. And then if I just skip one out there, but if I just go back to environmental concerns, the second line there around environmental degradation in terms of the system. So, basically that sort of core idea around sustainability and how sustainable is what we do now. So they were the reasons for people expressing negativity towards the sectors. So I just wanted to move on now in terms of some summary and implications. So just a bit of a summary again around the sort of key data and the things that stood out for us. So if we looked at previous years, particularly the 20 to 21 year, we saw improvements in the level of positivity across all of the animal industries. So sheep and beef farming up 8, dairy farming up 8, and deer farming up 9. And again, we've sort of thought about why is it that the deer farming may be less positive, or there might be a less positive sentiment than some of the other sectors. And I guess our view would be probably because it's the smallest of the animal industries and probably the least understood and visible to the broader public and their understanding of farming more generally. And then around the new questions or perhaps the new sectors that we thought about, very strong levels of positivity across all of those. So vegetables, fruit. We separated our kiwi fruit because of its scale. And then also arable, the cropping industries, and then viticulture and winemaking, grape growing and winemaking. So all 70% or above. And I guess the key thing is interesting to see there that the plant-based industries have higher levels of positivity than the animal-based industries, which was really interesting from our point of view. So just in terms of the sort of, I guess, overall things that we see in the data and that we've been talking about is that, generally it looks as though there is a growing appreciation over time. And I think it's certainly not going backwards. And that's probably quite different to some of the perception that we have inside our sectors sometimes. And again, there's this concept of a growing rural-urban divide. And just coming back to our why around this work, that was one of the things that we wanted to understand was that perception inside the sector of a growing rural-urban divide, or by some inside the sector, real, or was it just a perception? So did the data back it up? We'd argue probably that the data doesn't back it up. The positives were quite strong, and they related, not surprisingly, to things around economic activity, food security, and again, really interesting to see this point about price, which came out as well. Those that were positive saw it as an opportunity to be able to provide food more cost effectively. But equally, there was a view that sometimes imported foods were cheaper than domestic food production. So there were two sides of the coin expressed in terms of perceptions around domestic food cost. Those would be, I think, not surprising in any way. So contributions to trade and exports, are pretty well understood. And I think our experience is that by and large, people do understand that the food sectors, the fibre sectors, drive the merchandise exports out of New Zealand. We see a lot of media coverage and sort of broader conversation. Sometimes we sort of like to test this by, what do our friends and family talk about? They know you work in agriculture. What do they talk about if they come to dinner or to a barbecue? And certainly that economic activity, economic contribution would be one of the things that often gets discussed. There are concerns, though, and I think we need to acknowledge those concerns. We'll talk about this in a moment around environment, both broader sustainability issues of the system, but also individual elements of that. Chemical use would be one of those. And also in the question we saw genetic modification in there, which is obviously very topical in terms of potential changes to legislation and regulation here in New Zealand. But also cost of fresh food. And again, that's been topical in media, often topical around significant weather events when that puts pressure on food supply, particularly in vegetables and the annual crops. And so that came up in the conversation here as well. So again, nothing surprising, but there are things that concern people and there are things that need to be addressed and continue to be addressed and talked about. As we said, older respondents are more positive, and those differences between the industries in terms of, within the animal industries or within the plant-based industries, but then between the plant industries and the animal industries as well, were all interesting things to think about that came out of this as to why do people see it like that. So just before we finish up and go into Q&A, just wanted to talk about what we think some of the implications for this might be. And so the first one really is that the sector is valued. If we look broadly into the population, those who don't necessarily have strong connections or are working in the food and fibre sectors, the broader view is that the sector's valued. So strong support. In some of our sectors, a large level of, I'm not sure, a large level of uncertainty in the sense of, not positive, not negative, I'm just not sure. And so that's potentially something to be addressed, but often quite low levels of described negativity. And so that goes against this sort of idea that we hear about sometimes around a growing rural-urban divide. One of the challenges, I think, is that how do you address that? How do you address the uncertainty to give clarity or talk about what you're doing, or how do you address some of those concerns? And, there's a reality that building understanding and empathy in the broader population is a challenge. We're all busy. And so, getting real depth of understanding as to what we do on farm or in our orchards, that connection to why exporting is important, etc., in terms of economic health, is often really difficult to get headspace and mind space in the broader population. And so I guess my view would be that it's not because people don't care, but they have other things that they're thinking about in their busy lives. And so when you think about that, if you want to change perceptions or address some of those challenges that people see, understanding that particular reality is pretty important. Broadly, the economic contribution, the value of food production is recognised within the broader New Zealand population, and that those concerns that we've talked about, really need to be acknowledged, and communication from the broader sectors about how they're being addressed, and focusing in on those particular areas of concern rather than trying to cover everything. Thinking also about what else is required to build confidence. So is there quality assurance schemes, which are in place in many of our industries, for example, or what else could be done? But certainly acknowledging those concerns, but not seeing them through that lens of a rural-urban divide, we think is really important. The last one I just want to highlight too before we move to Q&A is really around younger New Zealanders, and the data suggests they're not as supportive. Often that's couched as a growing separation between urban communities and rural communities, and not as many people having connections to family and friends who are actively involved in farming and growing. And while I think that might be true to some extent, I also think there's something more going on here. And to some extent, that disconnection in terms of family and connection with friends has been probably in place for a while, and we're probably a generation away from those very deep roots that most New Zealanders had into farming and growing. So understanding what is it that concerns, how does that connect to those issues around, for example, environmental impact, cost of food, et cetera, and how is that influencing young New Zealanders? There's also a really practical implication here for the sectors. And so what challenge does that provide to attracting and then retaining young New Zealanders in the sector through all of the roles and the myriad of roles that exist, whether that's actively involved in production, on farm, in orchard, etc., or whether that's through the service sector, and how might we tap into beyond our rural communities and into our urban communities to encourage people to come and work in the sector. So, Kyla, I'm going to stop there, and Mark and I are happy to take questions if there are any.
Great. Thank you for that. No, it's really insightful. We have got one question at the minute, but if you do have any more, TC, if you could pop it into the Q&A, but otherwise, if you want to, if you do want to go live, then I can grant you those permissions. So the first question we had was, is there any reason that seafood, in particular aquaculture, was not included in the survey?
Yeah, no, probably historical, I guess. We focused on the land-based industries here, although we haven't included forestry, we'd note as well, which is part of the sort of broader food and fibre sector. So probably around the sort of historical development of the piece of work, Kyla, but nothing more than that. It's a great question, actually.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
I just have one point on that. It's also a practical implication. You can't keep asking people the same question. They'll leave the survey and just get annoyed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Here we go. Regarding the younger persons, the issue there, to what degree do younger people become more positive about the food sector as they get older?
Yeah. Mark, I'm going to draw you into this one because you've probably got a lot more depth in this than me. Look, I thought about this one a bit, Kyla, and this is from me, I'm not sure for Mark, but an observation without data. Look, I think there is something that happens as you mature, and probably potentially around families and all of those sort of things that might get you thinking about food and where does food come from, etc. That perhaps you don't think about when you're in your late teens or early to mid 20s. I don't have a great answer for that. And I've heard people argue, that it is something that happens naturally as you age, and as others argue that, you get more information and you become more informed. I don't have an answer for that one. Mark, have you got any perspectives on that in other work you've done?
Yeah, well, it's only really speculation, and I've watched my daughter who turned into a vegetarian because it just isn't cool to eat animals for a while there.
Mm.
And that's quite a normal process to go through. Then, as you say, you get older, you get exposed to more information. I think a big thing is you start to understand the economic importance of the primary sector to us as a country.
Yeah. Tyler, one thing I would say too would be one of the other things I've done for the last few years is I'm involved with a program called the Kellogg Rural Leadership Program. So this is sort of 25 to 45-year-olds typically who are working in the sector. They might be farming and growing themselves, or they might be working in the service sector. But I think one of the things that really strikes me in that younger age group, particularly at the younger end of that range, is that the sort of values around stewardship, care, whether it's land, animals, whatever it might be, are very strong. And so I don't think it's about um, an inside the sector view versus an outside the sector view. I think many of those things that you sort of see coming through in those reasons for positivity or negativity are equally held by a younger demographic that is actively working in the sector and sees their future in the sector. So I think there have been some sort of values shifts, if you like. You know, if we think about that, that's not surprising that the broader sort of rise of discussion and understanding of environmental impact, not just in agriculture, but more broadly. So something's going on, I think, from a society point of view that impacts those inside the sector who want to stay in the sector, as well as the broader community.
Yeah, great, thanks. Kind of expanding from that, there's another question about it's interesting to see the domestic food security becoming more important to people.
Yeah.
While that has come up, what has become less important on the positive side?
Mark, have you got anything that you call out that you think's become less important on the positive reasons? We probably did the work a little bit differently in this one compared to previous data sets, eh?
Yeah, I've done work in the past when people used to be quite concerned about corporate farming and how that's sort of seen as taking over the primary sector. We didn't see that come up in this one at all, so I don't know whether that's a change, whether people are seeing that corporate farming can actually invest more and actually that you can connect better environmental outcomes with some kinds of corporate farming. I don't know actually, but that wasn't something that came up so strong in this round.
Mm.
Okay, thank you. And then a final one, which I think might lend itself. Well, it's a whole big discussion, but I'm also hoping to host another webinar on this in the future. But it was around the uninformed versus the expert divide. So both GM and food additives are safe, and the science has shown that. How do we fix this divide? I mean, personally, I think that GM had a really poor science communication strategy, and it's really hard to come back from that. And I don't know if there is anything that that has kind of turned something like that around. So how do we progress from here, and what do food producers, food organizations, what can they do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether we're talking about genetic modification, which is really topical at the moment because of the proposed changes, as we said, or the other issues that have been raised, and the ones that come up typically are things like animal welfare, as we said, the broader sort of systemic impacts of food production, the more specific ones around chemical use. Look, I think the data is critical. It's necessary but not sufficient, would be the way I'd describe it. And so just arguing from the data, I think, is not going to get us there, but it must underpin the things we say. And so, so that sort of broader understanding of impacts on people, how does it align to broader societal values? How do we show through the data that we're making improvement? I think our experience in this area is that being able to show improvement that is direction of travel and sort of your intent and where you want to get to is probably just as important sometimes as the individual data points themselves. And so, here's what we're doing, here's where we're trying to get to, here's why that's important to us and broader society from a values point of view. All of those things mixed together rather than just the data on its own are going to be really, really important because they're engaging. People engage with that. So I think there's some things we probably call out, Kyla.
Yeah. And when you're talking about kind of looking at how this progresses and keeping people engaged, are there plans to conduct a similar survey again of what's the next time period for looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't confirmed anything yet, but I think, and Mark, invite your comment here. This is always a really interesting piece of work in the sense of when you look back along the sort of time series, things do bob around a bit, but there are some sort of trends. But then when you get into the specific detail, things can, as we just talked about a moment ago, sort of pop up and then they fade away. And it's interesting in other pieces of work. I'm thinking about the KPMG agribusiness agenda. It's really interesting to see. I think that's been going for 13 years now. Very different sort of sample in terms of who they're drawing from, but there are things that sit in as top of mind or priority issues year after year after year. And for example, biosecurity would be one of those. So always right up the top of the list of priorities. But then there are other things that move in and out in terms of importance. And so sort of understanding that in this piece of work, I think is important as well. So not sure whether it'll be 12 months, 2 years, Kyla, but yeah, Mark, what do you think? It is important to keep track of this stuff, eh?
Yeah, it is really important, but when data moves, it normally moves for some kind of reason. If you look back on the trend line there, the big jump that we saw in 2020, that was because of COVID, because everyone was sitting on the couches getting fat, and farmers and health workers were out doing all the work, and they got a really big warm response from the general public who knew they need to be fed somehow, and these farmers are out there doing that.
Yeah.
And so the big things that are happening now is all the uncertainty around the world, all the geopolitical stuff, the stuff with Trump and America, and the wars that are going on, and so that may have some kind of impact. We don't know. And also, there's a big move going on with Fonterra at the moment. What it's thinking about doing with this brand, which is a massive topic that the public may be paying attention to. So when there's big topics like that, they may leap out of the primary sector and actually get into the public sector, that the general public, they actually connect to the primary sector. That's when views can get moved around a little bit. So it could be right for doing one sometime sort of part halfway through this year maybe.
Great. I'll let you get to that because it sounds like it will keep you busy and out of trouble for a few weeks. I don't know if I missed this, but where were the survey participants stored?
Where were they sourced?
Yeah.
Mark, do you want to talk to the methodology?
Yeah, it's an omnibus survey, and all the omnibus surveys are done on large panels. There's a few organisations that have panels of about 100,000 people. So any survey you see that's an online survey, it's not a representative survey of New Zealand. It's a representative survey, but it's taken off that database, and they make it representative by doing the weighting. And because there's 100,000, there'll be every kind of a view that's on that database. So all of these surveys are done off databases, massive databases, where people get paid a little bit. They get some points to do a survey, and that builds up through time.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's just wondered if I wasn't sure. Okay, I think we are out of questions. So thank you for your time today, Scott and Mark. It's been really valuable that Primary Purpose has been making a conscious effort to think about the perceptions of food and agriculture kind of outside of the sector, and really promising to hear the results as well. We've got the results, so it's up to the food industries to decide what they want to do about that, to kind of effect some positive change or to kind of improve their perceptions. So as usual, this has been recorded and will be available with previous webinars on our website under events, seminars. Let us know if there are any subjects that you would like to hear over the course of this year. Just drop myself or Michael Dunn, the centre's administrator, an email letting us know what you'd like to hear about. I'm just working on confirming our next session, so that will be advertised to you in the next couple of weeks. So please keep an eye out, and we hope to see you next. So everybody have a great rest of the week. Ka kite anō.
Thanks, Scott.
Bye, everybody.